Matt Parrino, thank you for joining me on the Paesanos podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I think the last time I saw you, you were on the sidelines at training camp
hmm
back in the summer. High expectations for the Buffalo Bills. The first thing that I want to ask you is how would you summarize the season that the Bills just had?
It's interesting, like getting the news today, Jessica Pagula kind of going in detail on what happened with her mother, Kim. Like, it's almost like people kind of forgot about that whole deal, right? Like, I don't want to say forgot about it, but like, you know, you move on to the season, the games start. And that was really, in a lot of ways, the top shooting and then that Kim Pagula health situation really kind of started off this season of just heartbreak for this organization, for the city. And obviously you get, right before the year, and then Dawson Knox with his brother losing him tragically, 20 some year old, young man from, I think he was at Old Miss. So it's like they've gone through so many different things and they've kind of been able to compartmentalize it. But I think you kind of see a little bit that in the end, I think it was just an organization that had been through so much. I mean, Kim Pagula, if you go read that piece by Jessica, she was so heavily involved in every aspect of the organization. To not have her around for a whole season, it has an impact.
Yeah, especially a season that needed that like so much influence from the top and so much called for so much leadership this year in ways that seasons haven't in the past. And I know you spoke a lot on your podcast, Shout, the Buffalo Bills football podcast. And you recently spoke with Jeff Pearlman, one of who you
Mhm.
spoke about as a journalism idol for you, about tragedy in sports, and there was enough of it to go around this season. Can you maybe recap a bit of those conversations that I know you've had in different arenas, just about what it's been like to cover so much tragedy in one season, frankly, but in sports in general?
Well, it's challenging. It's a challenge because you got two forces kind of up against each other for yourself internally. You have the journalism, truth seeking part of your job, and then the human element where, you have to, all these situations require such delicate, um, you know, uh, a delicate approach to how you cover it, to the conversations that you have with people around it. And I'm not just talking about people in the organization, but people, just regular people that ask. I mean, there's people that have asked me going back to June now, like about Kim Pagula every single stretch of this way. And I think the fact that you didn't hear something before this was really just a collective effort to allow the family at their time to kind of come out with it, and the details of it, and the fact that she's still dealing with aphasia and some memory loss. I mean, this is a significant event that happened to her. It's something that, you know heaven forbid that happens to anybody's, somebody in their family. It's horrible across the board. But she was so heavily involved with the operations of two major sports teams that it's just challenge all across the board for the people that were, you know, dealing with it on the inside, and then kind of us from a journalism perspective. And, with the Damar Hamlin thing, when I got a chance to talk to Jeff Pearlman, it was just about being on the ground. Um, in Cincinnati at Paycor Stadium when it was all happening, and you're dealing with at the time reports coming out from some local journalists about um, the severity of Damar Hamlin's situation. I mean, there was a couple things that I saw retweeted by reputable accounts that ended up not being true. Like, you got to be really careful if you don't have the information yourself in those moments. You don't really want to go with it. And I think that our coverage kind of followed that, and being on the ground and getting that major update the next day from his uncle was, um, you know, it was helpful for not only the community, but really across the board. I mean, I did CNN interviews, I did international TV interviews. I mean, that was the highest profile week professionally, and it comes at this really strange time when it's like you're dealing with somebody that might not make it, might not be the same person. And obviously, there's been this unbelievable recovery for Damar Hamlin, and every day the news seems to get better and better. But yeah, so that was from it was a weird thing professionally, pretty cool to get a chance to rap with Perlman, but the circumstances were tough.
The reason why I'm doing this podcast is because I want to explore the role that internet culture has in all of our lives. And I did a talk years ago, and the term Paesanos was used to indicate people that you know and you're friends with in real life, as opposed to the people that you only know online.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, that was almost 10 years ago. And I think those lines have been blurred a little bit more now. The relationships that we build as a result of the internet, and frankly, the careers that we build as a result of the internet, have become in real life relationships and in real life careers, and it's impossible to separate internet culture with the reality that we live today. And you started to talk a little bit about how these stories are coming out even from reputable sources that eventually proved to be incorrect. And what I really want to talk to you about is the role that the internet plays in the job that you do as a journalist, as a sports journalist, and maybe how that's affected your career. I won't say helped or hurt or either one of those things, but just starting from the high level, how do you feel that the internet has played a role in the career that you have today and the reporting that you do on a day by day, but also a minute by minute basis?
Yeah, I mean, if you even did this job 15 years ago, it was completely different. And so I think for the first and foremost, I'd say what the internet has done is it's allowed an opportunity to those that were able to adapt to traditional methods of covering sports teams and kind of flip it toward this immediate, all consuming, encompassing world where it wasn't like this before. I mean, to hear see any kind of like sports talk, right? Like, I mean, if you go back 15 years before First Take and all that kind of stuff, you'd have to listen to it on a radio show. Right now, it happens everywhere. It happens on the radio, it happens on the TV, happens on your Twitter feed. You can actually start as a fan. You can just start your own kind of podcast and do it that way. So I think that the internet for me, and where I'll credit it with my career, is that I saw what the environment was that I was going to be working in. And I kind of used all of the levers available to me to maximize my social media presence, my online presence. And we've shifted a lot, right? Like even 2 or 3 years ago, like the emphasis in journalism was so much on the stories, right? That we would write, like how many clicks are you getting, all that kind of stuff. Now it's more so about like building brand, I think, and then like what else do you offer too? Because sure, I want all the stories. That's like part of the deal, right? When we shake hands and you follow me, you want me to give you Bills coverage. That's part of it. But also, what else are you doing? You're doing a podcast, great. Do you interact with people on social media? There's a lot of journalists, sports journalists that don't like doing that. And I feel like you could see it in the numbers. Like they just kind of get lost behind. And I think in a lot of ways, for me, it's personal because as you know, I grew up in Buffalo and Bills fans are my people, right? Like I grew up in this culture in this town. And so for me, connecting with them, I feel like is just second nature because for 35 years I was one of them. But for a lot of people, sports journalists, it's almost like an annoyance. And I almost feel like, you know, you talk about like biases, right? I think that people maybe that come in out of market have a bias against it, right? Because they had their teams or experiences beforehand as they were kind of growing up. And maybe there's an element to, Buffalo or people that annoy them. But that doesn't really happen with me because this is just where I'm from. And I've dealt with Buffalo people for the majority of my life.
Yeah, and that's very clear and very evident in the way that you approach your job and how open you are to the reporting that you do, the way that you treat the team, treat the players, treat the city. A lot of that was on display this season, as we've talked about a bit. And a lot of that is on display online. You're very active on Twitter, obviously. You're active on Facebook. You share your podcast through YouTube and stuff. You have all these avenues by which people can reach you and comment on the work that you're doing. Um, how do you deal with that, and how what's it like? I mean, covering sports when that conversation never really stops.
Um, it's a great question. I think sometimes you need to press pause. You need to know when to kind of put the phone down, put the apps away, because I mean it can be consuming. And I have two little kids. I coach my son's travel baseball team. Um, I have other interests. I try to spend time with my family, do different things. So to get away from it at times is really important. But I also think that I've developed and curated a very healthy online community. So if you don't fit into that community, and that's okay, like we might not see eye to eye, and you might disagree with me, right, on a Bills subject. That's fine. Like I have plenty of people that come in my comments and disagree with me pretty consistently that I still interact with on the regular. As soon as it turns like negative or harassment, I usually just boot them out of the community. And most of the platforms allow you to do that pretty easily. But you gotta navigate that part of it too, because I think it could be a little bit of a I think that it could be counterproductive to spend time that on social media platforms in the negative space, because we got enough of that going on in other like themes, other topics that are covered on those platforms. Obviously politics has never been as divisive as it is today, and so I try to keep it you know uplifting, inclusive, and I think that people kind of get that, and that's why the interactions tend to be productive.
It does seem that way, and I feel like there aren't many careers out there where that question would be irrelevant. Like how do you disconnect? How do you set the phone down? And even if it's not part of your career, being online and answering emails and questions all the time, it's part of daily life right now. And um, seeing and having those interactions all the time for you, and having two young kids that you're bringing up and trying to set a good example for. Is that ever anything that crosses your mind about like the way that they interface with screens and phones, or the way that they see you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's been times when both of my kids have said, "Oh, Daddy, you're always on your phone," right? And that is a concern, especially because we're a family that doesn't really allow much screen time in the handheld variety. They watch TV and everything like that. It's not, but no video games, no iPads, no iPhone, none of that kind of stuff. I have an 8 and almost 5. And so it's kind of going to be tough because they're sitting there, especially for my 8-year-old, like, all right, what's the rub here? Every time I look at you, you're on your phone, but you tell me I can never do that. So it's definitely a challenge. But I also explain it's just part of my job, and one day they'll have a job, and it might include if they're a lawyer, they're going to be on their phone a lot of times. If they're a doctor, they're going to be on their phones a lot of the time. Like there's certain professions where probably not the same way where it's like you can never put it down in the way that my job works. Um, but yeah, we try to just be upfront with them and explain it to them. And my son, he sees me doing all these different things, like whether it be on TV before the games or on the podcast, or stuff my wife will show him on her phone. And so he's kind of just used to it. I think at this point he gets like, oh, Dad's just doing work.
Now, a lot of people talk, and it's easy to talk about the negative side effects of a lot of that, but I think because of such a tightly connected world now, there are also a lot of benefits to constantly being connected. Jeff Pearlman is someone that you mentioned earlier, and when we were talking about covering tragedy in sports, and he's someone that I understand you were able to reconnect around the Damar Hamlin story. Do you think that that would have been possible, without that constant connection, or have there been any relationships that you've been able to build as a result of being online and just being out there and available for people?
Yeah, I think that there's a healthy percentage of relationships that I've built just based on social media presence. In our world, like that's where people like. I have a good story about that actually. Like so, Ross Tucker used to play offensive line for the Bills. He's now in the podcast space, media space. He's a sideline reporter, NFL, college. He does a lot of stuff. And actually, one of the top NFL podcasts in the world. Like he's really done a really good job. And I had him on my show once. We connected on social media, followed each other on social media. And this past season, I ended up seeing him a lot more. Like he was covering a lot of Bills games. And we never like actually sat and had a long conversation. But every time we walk by each other at the Bills facility, it's like handshake, like we were but couple of old friends, kind of like at one point, I think like a little like half hug. And we only know each other from social media interactions at this point. He's been on my show, of course, so there's that interpersonal part of it too, but he's doing a million podcasts a week and like with a million different people. And so that connection comes, I think, from the impact that you made on somebody on social media. And I think in a perfect world, I love to be able to have all the relationships that I have some type of in-person like element to them. But that's one cool one that I think is just like, we get it, we're both super busy. Some people fit in different pockets in your life, and um that's the way that this relationship has worked to this point. And there's, I could probably talk about dozens of those.
Yeah, I mean, you're around obviously journalists all the time and professional athletes all the time. Um, how do you see them dealing with it? I can't imagine trying to do the job of a job that requires so much time and so much focus. And you see some of these athletes that are just online all the time. It seems.
Right.
I know that they're not, obviously, because they wouldn't get to that level
Right.
if they were easily distracted. But how do you see them dealing with that reality?
I think some deal with it better than others. One person I think we could all agree that didn't handle it very well the last couple of years was Cole Beasley, and he's admitted as much. I mean, he's somebody that he talked about when he got here in 2019 about, one of the things he was working on is like you just putting down social media and getting off of it, and like nothing productive was coming from it. And COVID hit, and he couldn't stop firing off controversial tweets, and it's not even really about like the contents of the messages. It's about, like, to your point, these are professional athletes. Like every little distraction could be the difference between getting ready to play that week. Like not only when Cole Beasley sent out a tweet was it affecting him having to get asked about it, it was all of his teammates and coaches being asked about it as well. And so yeah, there's productive ways to use your social media, and then there's like really just explosive ways to use it. And everybody's got to have an opinion on everything today. Like that's one piece of it that I struggle with too. Like sometimes I just want to, the traditional newsman in me just wants to present something without having a take on it. But everybody wants the take on it. It's like, okay, it is what it is, but what do you think about it? Because I want you, I can't make up my own mind. I want you to tell me what to think about it. And I think that's a bigger byproduct of the problem that we're facing as a society in general, is that everybody's looking at everybody else to dictate what individuals should think about certain topics and certain things. And I think sometimes we just got to do a little bit more critical thinking. It's the reason we spent all these years in school. And a lot of times people just want to be fed what they're supposed to think.
Yeah, I was listening to a conversation recently where someone was talking about that critical thinking time that you just mentioned, and sitting back and collecting your own thoughts and knowing what you feel about things, as a contrary to constantly being on the phone and looking for other people's takes, and how doing the latter actually forms your brain. Like if you're just
Right.
constantly reading other people's takes, um, literally from a scientific perspective, that's how you're developing your brain. And
Yeah.
then you start to lose the ability to form thoughts on your own. And I heard that, and I immediately turned off the podcast I was listening to just to sit and think for a while, because I was
Good.
like, well, now is a good time to do that. But it sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing. And from the athlete's perspective, you bring up Cole Beasley, and that's a good example. And I also think about like the Snowman and Isaiah McKenzie doing their locker room karaoke every
Mhm.
week, and putting that online and having a little bit of fun with it. There's two sides to that. There's
Right.
two sides of putting stuff out in a constantly connected world.
Yeah, and like those guys, first of all, Dion's great. Mackenzie's great. Like it's entertaining, right? Like it's they're connecting with they're having fun. They're connecting with the fan base. Like, but it turned into almost like this expected Friday event, right? Like where it's like, you know, you could take a week off. Like you don't have to do it every week, right? But like they had fun with it, and I kind of get it. And to be honest with you, that I think that's a healthy use of social media. It probably was a big like, maybe they were looking at it like, okay, on Friday we're done with all the practices, we're on to game day. Like it's this big sigh of relief, and we're gonna party a little bit, and enjoy it. But yeah, social media in the way that it's interesting. Like, so apparently Stefan Diggs deleted all of his Instagram posts. This is a very common thing for like skill position players in the NFL the last couple of years. It's I can't remember who the first one to do it, but Tre'Davious White did it a couple of years ago, and obviously all of the and it creates this like self-driven drama, right? Like because you're starting that, like Stefan Diggs is starting that, and then I guarantee you when we ask him about that, there's going to be a level of agitation about having to answer for it. But he's putting that out in the world. Like he made that decision to have that action that now needs questions formed that need to be answered based on that, especially considering where things left off last season, the lasting image that will Bills fans will have all offseason with him with his hands up to a quarterback that wouldn't even recognize, like even like pop his head up. And then it's
Mm-hmm.
like he doesn't talk. Like he hasn't done any interviews since then. And this is very typical of Diggs. Like he didn't talk after the KC game 2 years ago or last season. So this isn't anything new in terms of behavior. But sometimes I think like there's this like misconception of like you don't need to do certain things. And if you do it, from my perspective, and I can only guess why, it's you want the attention placed on that thing. And so now when it becomes like a conversation point on, podcast, and then eventually like when training camp hits or OTAs and minicamp, it was of the self-created variety. But there's and Diggs is great, so I'm not trying to like dump on him too much, but it just from my perspective, it then gets a little bit annoying when you put this out there and then there's this kind of like eye roll when you're asked about it. So it's coming.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting because everyone's got a different way of using social media, and deleting it is one way of using it. I mean, that's a tool, that's a thing that Diggs would not have been able to do 20 years ago. Like
Right.
that's a statement that he just wouldn't have been able to make if he was frustrated or wanted to symbolically erase the last season or whatever. Like that wouldn't have been possible for him to do. So it's still a statement. Um, and I'm thinking as you're talking about the story that Jessica Pagula shared this morning, and I know you've already broken that down a little bit, but another avenue is to not address what's going on at all, and that's one thing that the Pagula family sort of decided right from the start, as it turns out, with the cardiac arrest that Kim Pagula that happened to Kim Pagula this offseason. And Jessica is just now talking about it. She's a professional athlete herself. She's a number 3 ranked tennis player in the world, and her approach was to not address it at all until now. and it's just interesting to think about, all the different ways that these athletes and we're talking about athletes, but everyone in the journalism field, in my field, in social media, in digital marketing in general, that we choose to use or not use what's out there for us.
And I think sometimes things are accidents. Like I think sometimes you don't know what to do. I wonder how much of this was just like not knowing how to really get around this story. And of course, you don't want to like guess at stuff like this, but you know, it's an evolving situation for Kim Pagula. It sounds like there's new parts of recovery every single day. It's probably a completely different situation today than it was even a month or two ago. And so I get that kind of piece of it, like wanting to, wait till you have some kind of hold on what the situation and circumstances are. But in terms of just social media use in general, yeah, like it's crazy. Like every little decision that you can make, from what you reshare, what you like that could have an impact on your brand in the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day. And I try to be like super neutral with stuff like that too, because I don't want to alienate anybody. I'm never going to stand for like anything hateful, so I don't really like put up with that kind of stuff. If you're coming with some type of that hateful agenda or like stuff like that, it usually makes its way out of the conversation quickly. But for the most part, we're all just people that are kind of, have a bunch of different ideas. We're sharing. It's the easiest way to share them. And also like, just talk about like, I was a communication major at UB. And so one of the things that I think is super interesting about online communication versus in-person communication, what you'd say to somebody that you don't know online versus what you'd say to them in person, that you say in person that you don't know, drastically different. I mean, you could put 10 or 15 different scenarios together of what you'd even be talking about with that person, and they would play out 100% completely different online. I shouldn't say 100%, maybe like 90 to 95%,
Mm-hmm.
completely different. Some people are just straight up assholes, and they're not like afraid to bring it in person too. I mean, just take a
Mm-hmm.
trip to your local grocery store, and I'm sure you'll see a few of those folks. But that that's to me the thing that you got to always remember. There's this need to react. That's what I've gotten really good at in my job, is like I don't react to vitriol like I did even 2 years ago, but definitely
Mm-hmm.
not the same way I did 5 years ago. I have a huge following, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if a person with a very small following says something nasty to me, if I respond in any way, I'm amplifying that. So I've come to learn that the best defense against that is just ignoring it, because at the end of the day, it just gets lost in the ether so quickly. Even stuff that really digs at you personally, like it
Mm-hmm.
gets lost so quickly that we're already on to the next thing 10 minutes later. And so that's another piece of it that I've had to really just, it's its own world. It doesn't have any impact on the regular world. I mean, it does, it can. You mean you could get canceled, right, on social media, and that would have an
Yeah.
impact on the regular world. But I would say a big chunk of it really doesn't have any bleed over into what we experience in day to day in real life.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are about the same age. We went to school at the same time, and when we were in college, there wasn't any talk that I remember about social media as a platform, or
Mhm.
social media even as something that like a business would use, or that someone would use in a professional capacity. It was starting to come around in college, but it was definitely not part of any of the classes that I took.
Right.
Um, and uh, and so ultimately, having built a career around this type of media that didn't even exist when you and I were in college, um, we've had to kind of learn on the fly. And I mean, what you just shared is such a healthy perspective about that. And I know probably didn't come without making a mistake or amplifying some troll's message
Mhm.
sometime in the past, and then realizing, oh shit, I shouldn't have done that, and I'm guilty of that myself. And I wonder what some of the other things are that you've learned along the way as you've built a career, in frankly a landscape that just didn't exist before?
That's a good question too. First and foremost, I think like being willing to admit when you're wrong is huge. There's so many people in this business that give the takes, but it's on to the next take, and there's never like any type of look back or reflection on things that we were wrong about. And I'm as quick to talk about things that I was wrong about as I am to talk about things that I was right about and come dunking on people that disagreed with me, which I like to do. Um,
You're good
but
at that too.
yeah, I'm good at that too. But like, I think that that's healthy. I think that's important. I think like we don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. I don't care if you've been around football your whole life. There's things that you might say that don't end up being the case. And I think presenting yourself as some all knowing is, I don't know. It's just I don't like it. But in terms of things that I've learned, wow, you got me thinking about this. That was a good question. I think the importance of like the podcasting space is something that I kind of saw, and I always tell people this, that the key to the vision was the time I spent in the UFC, because podcasts were getting really big at the time in that space. Joe Rogan, obviously, back when he did mostly fight based podcasts before he was still doing the experience with these kind of off the wall like interviews, but it didn't turn it nearly as political until later on. Um, but he does a great job with those. And I always thought that they were super, interesting, and just this setting to have a conversation for a period of time to break things down. Ariel Helwani's done a show for many, many years. I took a lot of things from him as well. But I think that's the piece of it where people can really get to know you. And so when I meet people out that watch my show and they interact with me in person, it's like they already know me because they
Mm-hmm.
listen to me all the time. And I think that connectiveness too then helps keep that audience for your content, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if there's no, if I think now more than ever, because of how many options there are out there, there's got to be some type of reciprocal relationship here. Like, of course, I can't DM back 65,000 people in Twitter, right? Like that would be crazy. But when I do get one, I make it as much of a point as I can to interact with that person, share ideas, talk back and forth. Um, Again, as best I can. Comments online, meeting people out in person, so on and so forth. So I think that piece of it, like the way that created this relationship with the community too, was something that I learned how important it was early, and then executing the vision the proper way, the right elements, live and post production, etc. Something I definitely learned as I went.
Do you ever have conversations at Syracuse.com or New York Upstate or any of the places that you've worked about uh, those real life interactions with your fans? Because 65,000 people is just about the number that fill up the Bills Stadium on a Sunday afternoon,
Hmm.
and as you said, there's no way that you could possibly have a conversation with 65,000 people. There's no way that you could know 65,000 people, but in some ways they know you because you're out there, you're putting content out there all the time. Do you ever talk about that? Because I know the players do. I know the players talk all the time and they get training on how to deal with fans and that kind of thing. But do
Not
you have those conversations?
not really in that sense. I think more than anything, like I've become the expert on that. So I feel like people back at the company like elicit ideas from me on how to deal with stuff like that. It's conversations I always have with my boss, right? Like if there's something that my editor, if there's something that pops up on a given week, and it's something that I could see is going to be something that can turn heated or something in that range. I usually get it on his radar and we talk out pros and cons and so on and so forth. There haven't been a lot of those recently, which has been nice. But in recent years, that's definitely been the case. But no, not so much.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I didn't think about it before this conversation, but as you're talking about, how many people follow your writing and your interviews and podcasts and things, and in some ways probably feel like they know you, that it's got to be hard to have a conversation then when you meet someone in real life. They know a lot about you, and you know virtually nothing about them. And I hadn't thought about that before, especially as we're talking about building real life relationships as a result of the internet.
Yeah,
Appreciate that perspective.
yeah. I will say though too, like it benefits me in those scenarios that I'm inquisitive by nature. Like, so those conversations usually, if it was reversed, right? Like where I knew everything about a fan and the fan didn't know anything about me, I think it would be a little bit more awkward. But because I'm really good, I've done it so many times now where I've met fans and we've talked. Like I have like that, that firing squad of questions that I can throw out real quick to get you really like gets to know somebody really quickly, like what they're about, where they grew up, all those kinds of things. Um, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking some time to have this conversation today because I know that you do think deeply about this, and you're as far as journalists and sports reporters go, you are out there quite a bit, and you share a lot about the journeys that you've been on, and the way that you think about doing your job, and the way that you think about interacting with the players, the coaches, the fans, the other people in the media. So I appreciate you sharing some of that today. One last question is, the Bills are early betting favorites to win the Super Bowl next year. Are you putting your money down on that now?
Um, TBD. We'll see what happens here over the next couple of months. They got a lot of things to figure out with this roster. I know that they like it. What's going to happen with Jordan Poyer, Tremaine Edmonds? Those are big kind of pieces that you'll have to maybe work around. But I think it's about putting people around Josh Allen, and if they do a really good job of that, yeah, I'll be right back on board the hype train. Like, and I think for the most part, going 13-3 with the injuries that they suffered, all the off the field, on the field stuff that they dealt with. I mean, it was a pretty remarkable season, and I do have a level of understanding. Sports is such a macho world, right? Like, so it's like emotions or like talking about your feelings. It's not something that you know in previous decades was as accepted as it is now. But I do feel like listening to guys talk about it and like what it was like to go through this season, the Damar Hamlin situation in particular, that I just think it just really just took so much out of them. Like the emotional roller coaster of thinking that you're one of your good friends, your brother, that's how they view each other on these football teams, on sports teams in general, could die, go from that to then a couple weeks later, he's fine. He's walking back into the facility and it's this crazy turnaround. Like that is a up and down. And they always do a good job. They talk about it, not riding the emotional roller coaster, but that one's impossible not to get on because there's so many things kind of hitting you over the course. So you think maybe this makes them tougher, makes them stronger, and you can't imagine anything like this taking place next year, right? And so from that perspective, they'll probably be better, from a starting point. If they're not banged up and Von Miller's the same guy, yeah, I think they'll be there in the end.
Yeah, I love what you said about that, especially the fact that it's such a macho world, and yet in one of the most hyped and most viewed games of the year, those guys were crying, they were hugging and holding each other, they were supporting each other, they were dealing with emotions in a very raw way, and everyone who was watching, I think, understood that sports, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter as much as we want it to matter sometimes, or
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter as much as we make it matter in our own lives sometimes. And I hope they can bring that perspective into next year. And I love that they were able and willing to show it, to talk about it. And I hope they're able to do that a little bit more, even as we progress through the off season. And as I'm sure players, coaches, journalists, fans alike are dealing with the trauma all the stuff that happened this season.
Well said.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me and for being one of the first few guests on this podcast. I'm excited for this journey, and I'm excited to see the Bills win the Super Bowl next year.
Yeah, man, it's great to reconnect with you. Anytime you need me, let me know. It was a great conversation.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Take care.